That's what happens when I grab things and I don't have my glasses on. Okay, we are here. My coffee's over there, so let me get my coffee. Oh, it's empty. Let's see. I have 2 drinks here. I wanted 2 drinks to get started for an hour long reading. And now, I have too much cream in my coffee. Okay, so I was really proud of myself for starting my classes like right away. Even if I was just sort of bantering, I was starting them. Day number 202 in the classroom. We're here in the reading room, and now we're ready to get started. I have a comfy little pillow behind me. I have a nice cold water, which I'm going to take a swig of before I get started, with lots of lemon juice. And a little bit of sweetener for me. Not everybody needs it in the water. I like it. Makes me drink water more. Let's get a move on. Chapter 4, because we're usually here about 50 minutes is what it's averaging to take us through a chapter here in God is Red. The religious question. Just a little subjective opinion I'm going to interject. I liked this chapter. Indian activists holding religious ceremonies in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and concluding their stay by looting the building seems incongruous with ridiculous unless we probe deeper into the nature of the relationship between red and white men. So remember, we started chapter 1 with this whole incident, and what you can see, the author is doing a very organized look, as I've said before, at whatever he's saying, the author is saying, which, and going back to the Indian Affairs, said, okay, that's what, $65,000 worth of damage, $100,000, $1 million, and then down to, here's a couple bucks. It'll cover it. I might be exaggerating, but getting the gist of it. Indian activists accused of fomenting the destruction made a rather weak reply. What about the rape of the North American continent, the destruction of tribal cultures, the wasteful use of human beings, the deprivation of rights to a helpless minority? Do not these crimes make the destruction of a building pale to insignificance? They ask. Do they? In one sense, the capture and destruction of the Bureau of Indian Affairs appears as an historical anachronism. Watts burned in 1965. The urban areas seethed and burned following the death of Martin Luther King in 1968. It is not the Indian occupation of the federal building in the nation's capital an event dreadfully out of time? Is it not the final spasm of the rugged 1960s when any type of change was considered beneficial and the institutions of society were considered not only obsolete but malignant, as in bad? Only if we believe The Indian effort is raising the same issues as those raised in the early 1900s. Can we make that judgment? There certainly was an aspect in which the Indian takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was an event of the 1960s, although occurring in 1972. Since 1968, the major Christian denominations had been pouring funds into social movements of all kinds. They believed deeply in the militant version of Black Power, as violent confrontations and grants were made to organizations within the respective minority groups that they were sure would produce the desired confrontations. Do you hear what this author is saying? Minorities were paid to make good on these confrontations. That's what they're saying. And if you're oppressed, you might make good. You might stir things up a little bit. And you might have a few reasons to stir things up a little bit. See the Bookless classroom today, in the past. A group that snapped and snarled about their social problems stood a much better chance of receiving funds from the churches than did a group that calmly and carefully articulated a problem that they hoped to solve. Church officials often gauged their relevancy in proportion to the violence of the groups they were funding. Any church not receiving its share of frothing at the mouth demands for money felt isolated from the great events of the American social movement. Thus it was that when the American Indian movement captured a dormitory at Augustana College in Sioux Falls and presented a set of demands carefully worked out by sympathetic Lutherans in secret sessions, the Lutheran churches eagerly embraced the Indian cause. While they had not been overly enthusiastic about helping the blacks during the civil rights movement, some church officials felt that they could get the same kind of action from the Indians without taking a position on a social movement that would antagonize their church members. Many Lutherans were ecstatic when informed by Indians that they were guilty of America's sins against the Indians, and they embarked on a massive program of fundraising to pay for their alleged sins. But they were not the only victims, since the Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Congregationalists all gleefully responded to being told that they had been responsible for nearly all the problems of American Indians, and that they could purchase indulgences for these sins by funding the Indian activists to do whatever they felt necessary to correct the situation. By early 1971, almost every major Christian church had set up crisis funds to buy off whichever Indian protesters they might arrange to have visit them. Confrontations escalated as each group sought to become more relevant than its competitors, and the path toward destruction was clearly visible to everyone. In a real sense, Christian churches bought and paid for the Indian movement and its climactic destruction of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as surely as if they had written out specific orders to sack the Bureau headquarters on a contractual basis. The churches should be made to reimburse the American taxpayer for the destruction of federal property. If any agreement must be made with respect to the importance of property when discussing the incidents of the Indian movement. Not every Indian protest was inspired by the financial rewards to be gained from the churches by playing the protest game. Many of the incidents were valid protests by a people who had suffered too much for too long. Even more, younger Indians had seen in the civil rights movement that the institutions of this country respond only when there is threat to their property, or when disorder in their lives forces them to confront problems that have not been solved for generations. Yet the civil rights issue was peripheral at best when understood in the Indian context. The different tribal groups suffered discrimination and prejudice on a peculiarly tribal basis, and the broken treaties meant immediate hardship for the different communities. Could young Indians enter a civil rights movement and press for removal of discriminatory hiring practices while enjoying preference under federal law for employment in tribal programs? Few Indians ever accepted the premises of the civil rights movement, and if the tribal chairman demanded the prosecution of the Indian militants following the departure from the destroyed Bureau of Indian Affairs building, it was a weak response compared to tribal reactions on being asked to join the civil rights movement and marches half a decade earlier. That the basic goals of the civil rights movement could not attract more than a handful of Indians at any one time should give pause to everyone. What was it that turned Indians off other than the fear that they might be identified with blacks as a minority group? If we glance backward into American history, we may find a partial answer, at least an indication sufficient to raise the question that at some point must be asked. The civil rights movement was probably the last full-scale effort to realize the avowed goals of the Christian religion. For better than a century, the American political system had proclaimed the brotherhood of man as seen politically in the concepts of equality of opportunity and justice equally administered under the law. While the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund fought a series of brilliant court battles, making a goal for the great Supreme Court decisions, in the background certainly lurked the great Christian message of the brotherhood of man. When the struggle in the South reached the point, and then this coincides with the Jesuits' newer mission for ecclesiastical missions. I think I have that right. I'm not 100% sure. That's a part of the Catholic Church I'm not sure of, which goes in with their orders as well. I never knew what their orders were, because why do you have those in the first place? What do you have those? To respond to what? What's secret? Because nobody knows what your effing orders are about, but you all have to take them. When the struggle in the South reached the point of open boycott and nonviolent protest, it was the black Christian church leaders such as Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and Andrew Young who spearheaded the movement by translating Christian doctrines into political tools of resistance and eventually conquest. In large measure, the civil rights movement was a movement that found its ideology, strategy, and meaning in Christian religious doctrines. King's famous letter from jail in Birmingham was not addressed to the political leaders of the South or to liberals of the North, but to the Christian churchmen of the South, who were intent on reducing the Christian religion to a comforting and spineless recital of creeds. There had to be a point in Western history at which the whole ethos of the Christian religion was placed on the agenda to discover if the whole thing worked. The civil rights movement became the acid test in the field of domestic relations. Before the civil rights movement, however, one must look at the Nuremberg trials as the moment of history in which Western Christianity achieved its greatest influence. In those trials, the victorious Allied nations presumed to speak for all of civilized mankind and judged the Nazi leaders not as losers, but rather as men who had violated the basic tenets of man's civilized and religious existence. In doing so and setting themselves up as judges, the Western nations had first to overlook their Russian allies and second affirm before all mankind that they assumed that they stood sinless before all men and before history and were fit to judge. The Nazis. After the Nuremberg trials, it became more or less inevitable that the Western nations would fall victim to the moral and intellectual weaknesses in its own societies. Could one really judge Nazi leaders when in one's own nations captured German prisoners of war received better treatment than the black citizens who had captured them? No. The civil rights movement, once Nuremberg had taken place, was inevitable. From a crest in historical meaning, the logic of national identity called for an effort to realize the reality of the Christian religion on a political basis. America really had no choice but to embark eventually on a quest for post-Nuremberg meaning. That the civil rights movement began under the benign Eisenhower was an indication of the terrible conflicts in which America and its religious sensitivity would engage. If nothing else, Eisenhower personified the good citizen, the American Christian gentleman, the man to whom all good accrues because of his faithful adherence to the American credo. It was this terrible inconsistency that many Indians sensed as they approached the civil rights movement. In attempting to distinguish Indian concerns from the concerns felt by the black community and understood by their white allies, many Indians began to discover their own culture. They began to trace out the reality of their own religious experiences and began to distinguish between the technological superiority of the white man, and his moral corruption and the falsities of his religious facade. It was during the Eisenhower years that religious ceremonies of many of the tribes came out in the open after many decades of suppression. Through the 1960s, the civil rights movement gained power and strength, calling millions of people to commitments that many had never considered making. One cannot but review the many martyrs of the civil rights movement, black and white, to understand the violence of the time and many religious people's depth of commitment. From the era came men such as Malcolm Boyd, Harvey Cox, who in retrospect appear as valiant pioneers discerning a break in the ecclesiastical curtain, yet committed and powerless to break out of the deteriorating situation. I just want to say, they were mentioning some religious books. I looked them both, all of them up. We could take a really quick look at that. And so here is the one I'm reading. I decided to read, which is Seeker of Visions, Sioux Man, Medicine Man. But the other one was this one. No, not about the bird. I was looking up the birds though, because of that little bird and what it meant to have a bird here. Let me see here. This one, 7 Arrows. So I also looked up 7 Arrows. Those were the 2 religious books that they were talking about in this chapter. So I just wanted you to know that I do look some of those things up. The 2 main religious books they are talking about that they said were really good were 7 Arrows. This one is it keeps describing it as a heartbreaking story of victory, defeat, and a spiritual search. That I don't want to read heartbreaking stories. This one really seems to be a little bit less heartbreaking to me so far, although it really is more of a spiritual journey, and a spiritual journey that suggests real defiance of culture, right? A real defiance by this Sioux medicine man, John Fire, which is the English name they gave him. They called Fire. And he was like, that's the name we're going to give you. But the lame deer, which is interesting to me, right? So, like, you know, like that hurt bird that was out there. But the bird didn't look like it was hurt. It didn't look like it was hurt. Okay, anyway, so I just wanted you to know, because here is another thing that they're talking about here that may merit taking a look up of some of these names, right? Researching some of these names, like Malcolm Boyd and Harvey Cox. And actually, this is a good place for me to get out my little, which I bought, my little Post-it notes. And then the other ones that they were talking about, Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young. So I don't know those names, but some of those things are worth looking up a little bit later on, and sometimes I do, as you can see, with those religious texts, which I was kind of interested in reading about, and it really does give you a complete and entire perspective of somebody who stood for their beliefs and traditions and how they were raising their tribes and families. Very interesting, very different than our Christian American perspective and how to raise a family. So it really does teach you something, a real great difference in beliefs and ideology. Perhaps the civil rights movement held too much promise of a better society. The fervor it inspired in people could not be maintained in the face of exhausting sacrifices for a few intangible accomplishments. Within it was the implicit promise that a better society was but a short distance into the future, and the reality of that society became a means of sustaining the broken heads and broken spirits of the moment. For many young people, not in the social movement, the goal of discovering a reality to existence took a different track. The middle 1960s also saw the rise of drugs as an immediate release from the complexities of modern life, and Timothy Leary's admonition to drop out, turn on, and tune in spoke of the same stability of reality in the religious field as did King's dream of a just society and Feravich's dream of a just society. As the two movements began to intertwine, the formation of a counterculture was suggested as a means of explaining the apparent alienation between the two general modes of American existence. Martin Luther King spoke out against Vietnam. Suddenly a new international dimension impinged upon the consciousness of America. True to his Christian ideals and with insight rarely granted to a man, King saw the pervading nature of racism and oppression that led directly from the Christian idea of history, that we were in Southeast Asia and all derived directly from our conception of ourselves as guardians of history against all movements that would upset the balance we had achieved by military and economic power alone. King saw that there could be no solution to domestic problems without a solution to international problems, and solving international problems meant giving up the Western interpretation of history and the role of Western nations in history. Stokely Carmichael burst on the scene with his cry of Black Power, and the question of community integrity dominated conceptions of measuring social change. No longer was it possible to pass civil rights laws. Now the hold over local communities had to be surrendered. The idea of forming a unified and homogeneous nation vanished as blacks demanded the right to dissent culturally, and other groups, as if waiting for a signal, charged into the breach in the ideology of integration. Christianity had been built on individual response to external and often internal events. A universal brotherhood of responsible citizenship had been visualized in which, with every man acting responsibly, no rupture of the social fabric would occur. A universal brotherhood of responsible citizens had been visualized in which, with every man acting responsibly, no rupture in the social fabric would occur. Now it is all gone. In its place stood the racial and later ethnic communities, demanding the right to national existence in a melting pot society where there was to be neither Jew nor Gentile. Finally, the ecologists arrived with predictions so chilling as to frighten the strongest heart. At the present rate of deterioration, they told us mankind could expect only a generation before the species would be finally extinguished. How had this situation come about? Some ecologists told us that it was the old Christian idea of nature, the rejection of creation as a living ecosystem, and the concept of nature as depraved and an object for exploitation, nothing more. Almost immediately, young whites who were attracted by ecology were accused of copping out on the civil rights movement. A diversion, black activists cried, a means of taking the pressure off the corrupt governmental structures that refuse to give us our rights. What happened in the last decade is that in all probability, the logic of Western culture and the meaning of the Christian worldview, which supported the institutions of Western culture, were outrun by the events of the time. Brotherhood of man may be a noble ideal, but cannot be achieved in any society that is not homogeneous. Probably not, we discovered. At a certain point in the struggle for realization, it became apparent that goals of the civil rights movement could not be achieved because people did not subscribe to them, and because the goals were, after all, almost abstract projections of an ideal world, not descriptions of a real world. The collapse of the civil rights movement, the concern with Vietnam and the war, the escape to drugs, the rise of power movements, and the return to Mother Earth can all be understood as desperate efforts of groups of people to flee the abstract and find authenticity wherever it could be found. It was at this point that Indians became popular, and the visit and rapid interest that was generated in Indians as seen in literature would seem to indicate that America was looking for more than another minority group with which to play. The stoic and heroic red man, who had somehow gotten along in an almost idyllic existence prior to the coming of the white man, seemed to hold the key to survival and any meaning that America would now find for itself. If America was fooling itself, American Indians doubly fooled themselves. Every meeting, every convention, every gathering featured Indian spokesmen enthusiastically telling those assembled that the day of the American Indian was at hand. Ecological advertisements featured Indian actors paddling their canoes through polluted waters with tears running down their faces. Indians were ecstatic and mistaken. People began inquiring about the basic values of Indian life, and the rhetoric began to flow. Optimism ran rampant. It appeared as if for the first time Indians would be allowed to speak freely. Almost immediately, Indians came into contact with the world outside their tribal experiences. I bet if you took a look at that commercial that they were talking about with the Indian tear and the pollution, it was probably the same years of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So here you were beginning to get compassion for the Indian condition, and it was completely perverted and distracted and muddied by what people said. Oh my gosh, I'm ashamed of what those Indians did at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? Almost immediately, Indians came into contact with the world outside their tribal experiences. The churches insisted on funding activist groups' demonstrations, to the consternation of tribal officials. Indian activists became, in many instances, little more than puppets dancing for the liberal dollars. Many felt it more important to capture a mountain and the evening headlines than to fight against continuing confiscation of lands via termination. The Colville Reservation was nearly terminated for lack of people to oppose the policy, while 1,000 miles south, hundreds of young Indians milled around on Alcatraz looking for something to do. Tribal officials with a heady sense of power demanded and received lucrative government contracts under the new policy of self-determination, and by taking the federal funds forever surrendered their rights to criticize the policies of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Every new idea proposed in Indian conferences resulted in the creation of a new national organization of Indians. So here's where they're taking the welfare and saying you can't complain. The emotional conflicts of interest mounted. The political wars for control of large organizations with large budgets intensified to the point of near violence. What America would not see and American Indians unfortunately could not see was that they both were attempting to relate to the Indians of yesteryear. America attempted to find authenticity in American Indians, manifesting this effort in a number of diverse ways, some of which bordered on the bizarre. Many years before William Carlos Williams Let's start there. Wrote, the land, don't you feel it? Don't it make you want to go out and lift dead Indians tenderly from their graves to steal from them as if it must be clinging even to their corpses? Some authenticity? In 1971, of course, many Americans did just that. Exhausted spirituality, they began seeking the reality of Indian life in American Indians' bones and burial places. Exhausted spiritually, not spirituality, exhausted spiritually, they began seeking the reality of Indian life in the American Indians' bones and burial places. That Christian peoples, or even quasi-Christian peoples, could commit such an outrage is perhaps an indication of the extent of their desperation for what? Being spiritual, for spirituality is what they're saying. And if these were not Christians committing these acts, why did not the real Christians raise their voices in protest? Poples. Especially in the Iowa incident recounted earlier, the voices of even the true Christians were notably stilled. Where they came in and where they were destroyed that tribe, and were looking at their women and children. Among the Indian activists, a tremendous interest in tribal religions manifested itself early in the movement. Attendance at tribal ceremonies became almost as necessary as attendance at protests. The American Indian movement became so attached to the tribal religious ceremonies that more experienced Indians began referring to them as the Indian version of the Jesus freaks. But few Indians realized the extent to which the world had changed since the days of Chief Joseph. It was no longer feasible to change the wagon train, yet the tactics and emotions of the activists led directly to that state of mind. During the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters, many observers noted that some of the people were ready and willing to die in combat rather than give an inch in the negotiations. It was almost as if the ghost dance had returned with its tragic vision of Wounded Knee. What we basically experience in the recent Indian interest and the ensuing uprising in November of 1972 has been a tragic case of simultaneous arrival by all segments of American society at a state of religious crisis of unsuspected proportions. Americans are searching for a different religious understanding of the world, and in spite of the apparently short-lived Jesus movement, many people are seeking answers in American Indian religions, which must involve some forms of reconciliation with the American Indians and his lands. While the American Indian belief in the religious nature of lands has been neglected by non-Indian people, it has also been buffeted about by Indians themselves in recent years. The desperate nature of the Indian activist movement in reclaiming lands could be expressed best in political confrontations, but the understanding of the spiritual nature of lands still remained as an experience shared more by traditional and older Indians than by activists. Outside of Seven Arrows by Storm and speeches by Thomas Benyaka and some of the holy Hopi leaders, there has been a sparsity of effort made by Indians to educate Americans on the complexities of living with the particular land. The American white man is the victim of a process long predicted. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard both foresaw nearly a century ago a tragic breakdown in both the vision and values of Western man. For Kierkegaard, the solution to the problem, and then they were hated for it. It's like, just fucking pay attention to what I'm saying. It's going that direction. You don't care about that. You care about the messenger. For Kierkegaard, the solution to the problem became the excuse of an incredible power of will, which would lead Western man back to the world's fundamental realities as he knew it. Purity of heart, Kierkegaard thought, is to will one thing, the good, and having willed the good, it would eventually flow. Although few people would realize the tremendous spiritual and psychological costs required. Nietzsche announced the death of God and the creation of the Superman, perhaps glorifying so much in the will to power that he could not see the moral flaw and the exercise of energy without a benign goal as a precondition. He's theoretically speaking, pay attention, because this is the death of God. And you all hate Nietzsche because he said, this is the death of God. Listen to what this author is saying. Deloria. Nietzsche announced the death of God and the creation of a Superman, perhaps glorifying so much in the will to power that he could not see the moral flaw in the exercise of energy without a benign goal as a precondition. Explain the goal. He'd explain the goal to you. He expected you to get the goal. Pay attention to what's happening. If you want your Lord and God and Savior, you have abandoned him. God is dead because you abandoned him, and you hate Nietzsche because he said God is dead. He didn't recognize the moral flaw in what he was doing, which is saying, what is the goal? You can't see the goal here, and why I'm saying God is dead. Pay attention. And the rise and fall of National Social. Why aren't you afraid of what Nietzsche said and make him alive again? Right? Even if he was saying, here's my conclusion, which is what he was saying, by the way. Here's my conclusion. You don't act in Christian ways. Your God is dead because you don't even know who he is anymore. Do you understand how far you are from any authentic religion when you support this same kind of sheeple thinking in the fascist way? What was Nietzsche saying? Pay attention. He wasn't being a liberal progressive. He was giving you a dose of authenticity and reality based on your behavior. You don't get it. You don't get it. And you don't get it because you don't come into the light, because you're a coward, because you're sitting over there counting your dollars and cents in the dark hallway of your disastrous nightmare. In the rise and fall of National Socialism, we found Nietzsche's Superman coupled with an incomplete, distorted theory of genetic science and history. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche attempted to solve the problem of the decay of the Western vision of the world by using an Avis approach. Try harder. Yet the suggestions were so abstract as to prove demoniac in the practical area of daily life. Yet their suggestions were so abstract. They didn't get it. You didn't get it. You didn't get it. You want God to be alive. Try harder. But you didn't get the message. You didn't get it. And the same thing with Marxism. No different than Karl Marx. You don't get what he's saying. What you're saying he's saying, let's go and be rebels, right? No, that's not what he was saying. He said this is what's going to happen. Pay the fuck attention to what your treaties are saying and what your propaganda is saying and what your constitution is saying and what your moral backbone is saying to your empty-headed slime brain. I'm sorry, what? Was I reading or telling what I think? A more common sense approach to solving the problem of Western moral and intellectual inadequacies came in the earlier years of the century when Walter Rauschenbusch, 1861 to 1918, and other promulgated the social gospel. They visualized the fulfillment of the Christian kingdom on earth and the social reform movements of the American political arena. So we are going to see our Christian reform through politics, and all of a sudden Donald Trump became God. Labor organization, what do you say? Labor organization and restrictive laws on child labor and pure foods became a realization for them in the Western people's potential for creating a heavenly society without divine intervention. Unless you call science divine intervention, now we're talking. When the social gospel was brought into full confrontation with the American political system and the civil rights movement, it proved as ephemeral as any other doctrine. While advances were made in legislation, attitudes simply hardened around other things that politically could not be changed. Eventually, the conservative backlash overwhelmed the social gospel when Richard Nixon / Spiro Agnew / Billy Graham theology of unquestioning submission to political decisions and concentration on a personal relationship with God gained popularity. For a substantial number of Americans, there are no answers needed, for there are no questions to be asked. Oh, I'm sorry, send in the Catholics again? Yet because the drama is continually played out in religious terminology, we must conclude that the basic unanswered question is that of religious breakdown. Perhaps we have now come to realize that Western man cannot find his way in society either by demythologizing his condition as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and other social gospel people have attempted, to remythologizing it as Billy Graham and the fundamentalists have tried to do. Perhaps an entirely new analysis of the nature of society must be undertaken. Perhaps a new understanding of the nature of religion must be found. Recent literature would appear to indicate that people are already venturing on new paths of social analysis, trying to describe for us the task that lies ahead. We must begin to take our intellectual pioneers seriously for the first time in our existence. Gary Willis, for example, finds in 2 books, Nixon, Agonistus, and Bare Ruined Choirs, sufficient reason to believe that a political and religious turning point has occurred in the last decade. James Michener, in A Quality of Life, projects a sense of search for a new conception of our position in social history, finding a religious dimension about to be unveiled. The analysis of Harvey Cox in The Secular City remains valid for the segment of society that affects us most vitally, the affluent, educated urban man, who is found in embarrassing numbers of educational institutions and the communications media. In embarrassing numbers that you can't explain. You can't explain all those Catholics in the Supreme Court. Embarrassing numbers. While Charles Reich bubbles with optimism in The Greening of America, and we find ourselves unable to justify it, his essay on the new property easily qualifies as a crucial analysis of our contemporary problem in understanding the nature of wealth and income. Even more important, perhaps, Alvin Toffler's Future Shock and Vance Packard's A Nation of Strangers indicate the nature of change in which we are involved. Can we survive increasing speed and constant migration and hold the same religious convictions about the world that men held 2 centuries ago, or that they held even a century ago, or in the previous decade? Almost everywhere we turn, whether we be red, white, black, brown, or yellow, we are confronted with the necessity of renewing our vision of the totality of our existence. Oh, we don't even ask those questions. I'm sorry, those went out with Aristotle. What are you talking about? Purpose in life? I'm sorry, science, progressive. By which we can move forward and diverse peoples upon the continent. At no point, however, have we dug sufficiently into the nature of the problems we face to tear ourselves away from traditional assumptions and find a place to stand from which we can view the breadth and depth of the task. What's the task? To dig into the nature of these problems we have in America. I'm sorry, what? I'm part of the 1%. What are you talking about? The basic divergence of viewpoints between American Indians and the rest of American society must be seen, as mentioned before, in the conception of land, and the choice appears to be between conceiving of land either as a subject or an object. This analysis agrees strangely with the view expressed by Albert Camus in The Rebel. Remember we read Camus? I forgot what we read. An analysis of death and suicide. Camus finds the profound conflict in this century is perhaps not so much between German ideologies of history and Christian political concepts, which in a certain way are accomplices, in a great way, as between German dreams and Mediterranean traditions. In other words, between history and nature. Christianity, no doubt, was only able to conquer its Catholicity by assimilating as much as it could of Greek thought. But when the church dissipated its Mediterranean heritage, it placed the emphasis on history to the detriment of nature, caused the Gothic to triumph over the Romance, and destroying a limit in itself, has made increasing claims to temporal power and historical dynamism. When nature ceases to be an object of contemplation and admiration, it can be nothing more than material for an action that aims at transforming it. These tendencies, and not the concept of mediation, which would have compromised the real strength of Christianity, are triumphing in modern times to the detriment of Christianity itself by an inevitable turn of events. If, as Camus would define it, the choice of this century is between history and nature, and the rise of temporal power as a Christian goal has overshadowed its ability to mediate, then it would appear as if the 20th century will be a time when fundamental religious conceptions must be overhauled. Perhaps nowhere in Western culture is Gothic Christianity, as defined by Camus, so apparently strong as in the United States. Unhampered by the traditional tie between church and state, the American continent has seen a great proliferation of Christian sects that at least appear to exert a civilizing influence in American society. That this influence is often minimal cannot be doubted in view of the recent Vietnam experience and the domestic conflicts among the havers and the have-nots and the respective racial groups. The domestic struggles, however, have not been a total political or religious disaster. In many senses, the struggles of the last decade have given a much broader meaning to the nature of American citizenship than it ever enjoyed before. Much of the political polarization has been sparked by the American scene, from the major traditional Protestant denominations on what could be called the domestic left to the flag-waving fundamentalists on the right. Christians of all persuasions have been involved in either the foreign or domestic affairs of the last decade. Neither left-wing nor right-wing interpretations of Christianity has been able to impress its views on its polar opposite. While the fundamentalist churches appear at present to be attracting a much greater following, the political causes they apparently espouse would certainly indicate an intellectual bankruptcy of the most profound degree. How about that, fascist? How about that, right-wing fascist, conservative, fundamentalist? Did you hear what they just said? That you're attracting a much greater following that would indicate an intellectual bankruptcy of the most profound degree. Intellectual bankruptcy. You're stupid. You purposefully don't see what is in front of your face, and by avoiding what the obvious is, the authentic is, the truthfulness is, you have stupefied yourself. That's exactly what this is saying. You're stupid. That intellectual degradation that is going on behind the scenes in your brain, while you point the finger at me and said, we have 5 doctors who said your brain is broken. Are you fucking kidding me? Are they part of this intellectual bankruptcy? Are they part of this intellectual bankruptcy of the most profound degree? Those doctors, those 5 doctors who can't find one GD thing about me except for a false text in this time where all kinds of information is being perverted, that's what you have? Unbelievable. Intellectual bankruptcy of the most profound degree because you prefer to look at the world in inauthentic ways. Intellectual bankruptcy to the most profound degree. Well said, Deloria. I know. More established Protestant churches involved to a greater degree in civil rights and poverty-type programs likewise seem to depend on a sterile conception of social problems and social change, and while they are more in tune with actual social conditions than their brothers on the right, they are more concerned with their collective guilt as WASPs than with providing any significant leadership in solving social problems. And I'm a leader in this area, but I will tell you that that is the reason why I have always been a leftist, whatever the word is that you, a liberal, freedom. I'm sorry, is that what that meant? Oh, we want so much freedom. Stop with all your freedom. Stop it. Do you not know where you live in our history? Shut up with your freedom. BS. First Amendment bullshit. In the area of ecology, more than any other field, the Christian churches appear to be helpless. It is precisely this field that forms the cutting practical edge of which Albert Camus speaks. In the conception of man's religion, understanding neither left-wing or right-wing Christianity appears to understand the nature of the ecological disaster facing us, which is where the American Indians, where the Native Americans, Native Indians, however you want to say it, is their spirituality. That's where their spirituality lies. While you argue in your chaos collecting your dollars, you seem to have lost or fail to understand the nature of the ecological disaster facing us. Rather, they both seem to vest their faith in their miraculous ability of science to solve the problems of the dissipation of limited resources. The contemporary Christian mythos has been developed over a period of 2 centuries in which the exploitation of human and natural resources became increasingly sophisticated, with the singular concern for historical reality seen in its propensity to missionize. Christianity has avoided any rigorous consideration of ecological factors in favor of continuous efforts to realize the kingdom of God on earth. In their continued efforts to realize capitalism. They, about a decade ago, maybe not quite a decade ago, abandoned their faith. As the 20th century of Christian existence closes with social and political chaos, perhaps symbolized best by Lieutenant Calley and extreme racial tensions in the Western countries, we can conclude that the effort to build the nations of Western civilizations as prototypes of the kingdom of God has been largely for naught. The very diversity of the American people as revealed in the recent racial and ethnic power movements has probably given American Christianity a handicap that the domestic churches of no other nation have had to face. By the same token, the presence of such diversity enables the United States more than any other nation to undertake specific experiments in solving social and ecological problems. The present orientation of American intellectuals is not promising because they're experimenting. They're looking for let's just wait and see. We'll just wait and see. We'll just wait and see. Analysis appears to be centered on the possible minor adjustments to the social theories that came to dominate the 1960s rather than to a fundamental revision of our conception of the nature of our existence. Oh, why would we do that? We abandoned that thought process with Aristotle. After Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Sorry. The end. Jesus Christ came on board. He told us what to think. As against the various suggested analysis of misconceived social theories of the last decade, we have seen an increasing reliance on the development of citizens groups, chief of which is John Gardner's Common Cause, which primarily seeks increased activity and fails to demand examination of the basic assumption about the nature of man and society. The deterioration of American community life, as recorded in Vance Parker's A Nation of Strangers, would seem to indicate that rootlessness has become the major feature of American existence. And was it, if you taught Christianity 2 centuries ago, that is really what they would have said would have been the root of evilness, rootlessness, and that's the reason why they pointed their fingers at nomads, right? Rootlessness. And here we are purposefully uprooting me because I'm being oppressed and didn't meet their demands, breaking apart families. It is inconceivable to me how many families have been broken apart. Let's just start with COVID. Because of COVID, organized crime brought on by the religious right who said we wanted to bring families together. You're liars. You're liars. You wanted to bring your corporate dollars together so you can butt fuck one another and use your dollars as condoms. Precisely how responsibly exercised citizenship can flourish in this situation, which is being increasingly aggravated by the faster pace of existence described in Toffler's Future Shock, is apparently no consideration of the new citizenship movement. Nearly half a century ago, Chief Luther Standing Bear of the Sioux tribe commented on this strange inability of the white man to come to grips with the reality of American existence. What is it about your broken brain, white man, that you can't seem to understand that your behaviors have consequences and that the number one priority for anyone is not money? What is the matter with your inability to comprehend some of the basic theories of life? I'm sorry, is that your scientific bias that's clouding your broken brain? The white man does not understand America. He is too far removed from its formative processes. Oh, you mean because they were wrapping seeds with poison? We don't understand food? Is that what you're talking about? The roots of the tree of his life have not yet grasped the rock and the soil. Oh, read about the soil and the seeds, right? From the Bible, that's what I'm talking about. From the Bible, and where the seeds land, and the tares. He still has in his consciousness the perils of this frontier continent, some of its fastnesses not yet having yielded to his questing footsteps and inquiring eyes. He shudders still with the memory of the loss of his forefathers upon its scorching deserts and forbidding mountaintops. The man from Europe is still a foreigner and an alien, and he still hates the man who questioned his path across the continent. But in the Indian, the spirit of the land is still vested. It will be until other men are able to divine and meet its rhythm. Men must be born and reborn to belong. Their bodies must be formed of the dust of their forefathers' bones. Sounds like they're speaking Christianity. They're speaking your Bible, but it doesn't sound like you understand. I think that's the first thing that they said. The white man does not understand America. It may not be sufficient, therefore, to advocate a higher ethnic content to political, religious, and business activities, or to seek in education an answer to what must presumably be a philosophical attitude towards existence, rather than a specific belief or set of beliefs about existence. Attempting to shift the American Western Christian outlook from a preoccupation with a particular history. This is their whole time and space thing. So here's the giant theory that they're trying to get that the author's trying to get across very slowly, that American and Westernized thought is based on time, progression, get moving, production. Who are we going to be in the minds of future Americans? All time-based, when you do need to be space-based, based on where you are on this planet and what you need to be doing in your space. That is one of the main theses of this book. A preoccupation with a particular history and the great concern with time to an examination of spaces, places, and lands requires more than the relatively simple admission of guilt before ecological gurus, rather which they fail to do also. 50 years after this book is written, they still have failed to admit guilt to ecological gurus. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about, those tree huggers. Rather, a total reorientation as to the impact of viewing life in different categories must be established. Robert Ardrey's famous study, The Territorial Imperative, indicates a strong influence of living space on living species. As such, it forms a basic reference point from which new considerations can be understood. Both the Mediterranean here, if you pay attention to your space, you can see how space is used, how space is not used, what is necessary for resources, how people can use ecologically those resources. Pay attention to your space. As such, it forms a basic reference point from which new considerations can be understood. Both the Mediterranean heritage of Western Christianity and the American heritage of the American Indian tribes do not require a redefinition of spaces and places in terms of temporal concepts, but rather a relinquishment of temporal attitudes altogether and an acknowledgement of the reality of places, the essential need of life systems for spaces, and the reformation of social and political ideas around communal rather than individual considerations. When social problems of domestic America are viewed in this light, it becomes quickly apparent that ideologically the domestic world is characterized by the dichotomy of American Indian and immigrants' theories of social existence. We need to take on new theories is what they're saying. And well said, by the way, as you're pointing to the savages of this land, who's making their point in comprehensive and peaceful ways that American society generally cannot understand. Those who have been formed of the dust of their forefathers' bones, and those who were never able to release their spirits to the realities of this continent. One could not conceive, for example, of an American Indian feeling lost or alienated on the North American lands, only in the cities and other artificial constructs of this continent. D.H. Lawrence once remarked that while the American Indian would never again control the continent, he would forever haunt it. Perhaps the ultimate meaning of control is the ability to haunt. We come then to both a necessity to change and a possibility to do so. In attempting to contrast the worldviews of the American Indian with the imported assumptions of the immigrants who have been unable to find roots in this land, we can do no worse than to identify alternative paths to choose. The choice, of course, is another matter. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Do you just hear any more profound types of speech recently in new authors and new ideas and podcasts? How about some podcasts over here? I listen to Smartless and I enjoy it, but I listen to Smartless because I think they're sending me messages. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I'm picking up on the messages of that bird out there, of the messages on Smartless podcast, of the messages in this book. We're getting some messages down pat. That was chapter 4, the end of chapter 4. We will read chapter 5 tomorrow. We are busting through this book in day number 4 today of our book, God is Red, by Vinnie Deloria Jr. I don't know how you have such a wonderful grasp on the English language, but you sure do speak in such complete thoughts and complete sentences that make your long sentence structure, like mine, sound poetic. This is Dr. Annette Feravich trying to match the masterpiece that we are reading, God is Red, here in the reading room. Thanks for joining me.